Welcome to the Earthkeepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earthkeepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast. In the Earthkeepers podcast, we often talk about learning how to listen well, listen to the land, the family of creation, and to the spirit. How, though, can we listen to our relatives who live under the water? Our guest in this episode is my friend Joe Olson, who designs and builds hydrophones, that is, underwater microphones that he tailors specifically for hearing the voices of dolphins and whales. In fact, Joe recorded the voices of the whales at the opening of this episode. Today, though, we're going to turn the tables and record Joe. Joe, my brother, it's great to have you on the podcast. If you would, tell us a bit about what you've been up to lately.
I ran the business for 29 years, but I've been building hydrophones, which are underwater microphones.
Well, tell us the name of the company.
It's Cetacean Research Technology. It's still in business. I sold it. So there's one person running it now, doing an excellent job. That's wonderful. And cetacean means whales, dolphins, and porpoises.
The creation of hydrophones has led you to some really interesting situations and adventures, I would call them, and gotten you involved in different stories, some of which we'll talk about. But maybe let me ask generally, how have you seen hydrophones make a difference for those who need to listen to the voices of cetaceans?
Well, hydrophones have been really critical in a lot of different research projects. So just for science in general, to understand the behaviors of dolphins and whales, but not just dolphins and whales, fish as well. In fact, I got scolded by a fish biologist when I first started my company saying, "Why did you call it cetacean research? And fish make sounds too, you know?" And I didn't know. But several different species of fish are soniferous, right? They make grunts and burps and all kinds of weird sounds that are unique to that species. So it helps with simple things like conservation, knowing if there's a population of that animal in an area just by listening to their sounds, knowing when they're there at what time. But also noise is a big, big problem underwater. My hydrophones have been used a lot with monitoring for noise and to know if it's too loud, to know if it's present or not, and how it affects the behavior of the animals. So you can listen to the sounds of the noise and the animals and see if their vocalizations change in the presence of anthropogenic noise or human-caused sounds. We're constantly bombarding all the underwater creatures with noise, like we're doing in the air. But in the air, humans hear it, so we have all kinds of OSHA regulations and times when you can't make noise because it affects humans. But under the water, first of all, nobody's listening, or very few people are listening. And secondly, there aren't people there, so very few people care. But it's a big deal, and it doesn't just disturb the whales, it masks the reflected sounds of their echolocation. So masking is when a sound is loud enough that you can't hear the sound that you want to hear. And you think about when you're at a party, or even when you go to a restaurant, when you're first there with just one person and no one else is there, and you can talk quietly. And then as more diners start coming in, and they're talking quietly, but then their sound makes it a little bit harder for you to hear. So now you start talking a little bit louder and louder. And that's called the Lombard effect, where people just keep raising their voices to be heard. And when things get loud underwater, the orcas have to vocalize a little bit louder. So there's sounds, but it's not just so they can hear themselves. They have to vocalize louder so they can see their prey, because they literally see with sound. So when that echolocation clip goes out, when it bounces back, they may not hear the returned echo. So they have to be closer to it. That means that the range that they can hear is way smaller, which means the amount of food they have available is smaller. So it affects their communication, their ability to see and find each other, their ability to see and find prey.
Why do you think it's important that we listen to whales and dolphins?
When we listen, we connect. And more than seeing, because to me, sight, even though it's still a wave, it's passive. It hits us, right? But we create sound and we receive sound. And we can feel, not just with our ears, but even with our bodies, vibrations from sound. So there's something about sound that just, it really connects us bidirectionally in two ways. Once we start listening under the water, it opens up this whole new world. Because to people on the surface, especially when you're on a boat, all you see is the surface and the little things that jump out of the water. But as soon as you listen, now you're connected to everything below. When you listen underwater, then even if you don't see the animals, then you can hear them, right? And that just makes a more visceral connection.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of something you told me earlier. I believe it was in New Zealand, where a whale watching company wanted to order hydrophones in order to augment that visual experience. Is that the case?
Well, yeah. So this was back in 1995 when I had first started my company. I had a hydrophone with me, and almost no whale watch boats had hydrophones at the time. So I went up to one and said, hey, I have a hydrophone. And they said, here, take a free whale watch trip. And then, yes, they started ordering hydrophones because they wanted that experience of listening. And now, I don't know if I could say most whale watch companies, but many of them have hydrophones because they understand that connection is really important.
Yeah. Well, our organization, Circleward, the parent company to the podcast, we talk a lot about learning to listen to the created world. But this is quite literally learning how to listen with your ears. And I think that in some ways, when you talk about listening to the voices of cetaceans, really what you're doing in some ways is reducing that barrier between you and them. It's almost like personalizing these beings that we don't otherwise see except when they're breaching the water, right? So I'm resonating really with that idea that sound connects. And I think that there's almost a philosophical grounding to this idea that listening to the voices of whales and dolphins can help us to care about them more. Do you think that's true?
Absolutely.
I know that one of the adventures you were involved in was with a baby orca called Springer. Can you tell us that story and then talk about how you got involved?
I got a call from, I think it was Mark Sears, who does whale research here in the Seattle area, saying, hey, there's this baby orca here. We don't know who she is, or it is. We didn't know the sex yet. Don't know who it is or where it belongs. We can't tell because there's some skin condition that you can't really see the saddle patch. Can you come bring your hydrophones? Let's try to record the sounds and see if we can figure out where the whale belongs. Because the orcas, John Ford discovered back in the 1980s, have individual dialects within their pods and within their subpods. So each family unit has some sound that they make that's unique to theirs. And then within the bigger community, they all share sounds. But then in between communities, let's say the southern resident community and the northern residents, they don't share sounds. They're totally different. So they didn't know if the whale was northern resident, southern resident. They thought it was from the south because this is their range. So I went out at a really cold January day and recorded the sounds, and she came right up to the boat because there was a stick that she liked playing with, just like a puppy. And she would hang out with that stick. She was craving affection because the orcas are very tactile also. When they're together in their pods, they're constantly in contact. They may rub flippers together for long periods of time or just brush against each other. So she was a lonely little whale. And I made some recordings and then sent them off to John Ford and to Paul Spong, who runs Orca Lab up in British Columbia. And I think they determined that they were from a pod, but that's a huge community of whales. So then Dr. David Bain here in Seattle took my hydrophone out, recorded some more, and he got a sound that was unique to the A4 subpod. So just a very smaller family unit. So that means that this whale is making that call. That's her home. That's as far as we could tell. That had to be where she came from. There were some town meetings that were citizens, just regular public came in, and scientists and conservationists to talk about what to do with this whale. Do we leave her here for nature to take its course? Which in the beginning I thought was what we should do. Or do we try to get her to go home? And there was a danger with that, because if she was deemed not able to go back home, she would go to an aquarium. And there were people who were very afraid of that.
So just to help us to understand what it is you're talking about, why don't we play some of the recordings that you've made of Springer, and then maybe you can explain what we're hearing a little bit after.
Okay.
So in essence, because they were able to match some of the sound components the Springer was making with the unique sound language used by a specific pod further north, they were able to determine where it was that she needed to go. So what happened at that point?
Once we determined, the public and the government and the NGOs, everybody determined that they wanted Springer to go home, then it was all hands on deck. All the businesses around Seattle, everyone was volunteering to donate. Everybody wanted to donate whatever they could to help. Donate fish, donate a mattress to put her on to when they had to lift her out of the water. And she was brought to a net pen over in Manchester, across Puget Sound from Seattle, and given fish and medicine and dewormed. And after 1 month, I think it was only 1 month, she was so much healthier, way more active. Her skin was clearing up, and a local company donated a boat to bring her up to Canada, and she was put inside what's called a beluga box. It was just a box that aquariums use filled with water to transport belugas. She fit perfectly in there because she was only a 2-year-old orca, and put her on the boat, took her up to Don Chong Bay on Hanson Island in Vancouver, and within 24 hours, she was free. That night, her pod came by, and they vocalized. And then either later that evening or in the morning, they lifted the net and let her out. And she swam out. She just bolted out. And she swam right to them, but then they went one way and she went the other way. But then after a few hours, they kind of reacquainted, and she then was trailing them for a while, but eventually after a few days was right there with them. Now, as of last year, there was a 20th anniversary, she had at least 2 calves.
Oh, right.
She's totally integrated. She's a mother.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, very successful.
Right.
And to me, that whole episode with Springer just shows what people can do when we all work together and we care and we have a common goal. And I think it's really easy when it's a baby, a lost baby trying to find its way home. And that's really what got the people all on board. I think a young 8 or 10-year-old boy was at a public meeting and said, well, I know if I was lost and couldn't find my way home, I want people to try to get me home. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it brings up that the reality that, again, it helps to find the ways that people connect to stories.
Yeah.
Even though they're probably more important stories, maybe more serious stories of whale decimation, what have you.
Yes.
But I think people connect to certain things, like they connect to the idea that whales are vocalizing and meaning things in their language, or in this case, a baby whale is in need,
right,
lost without its mother. Yeah, I think that that's really the power of the story. But I really agree with you as well that it's clearly a story of community action, and all the people involved were necessary for that story to have a good ending.
Everybody was working for this whale. You know, what you just said is so true about these bigger overall problems, and this is one whale, and the thing is that one whale, now there's 3 whales, and everything we do now that affects the whole ecosystem still affects Springer and her calf. So it can still go back to that whale, to that connection that we have. And I think if we're able to do that more on a global level, even if it's imaginary, even if we don't know of the individual, there still are those individuals, right? They're still the ones that I think, at least they tug at my heartstring. Yeah.
Well, the existence of these distinct languages or vocalization groups that helped Springer to be returned to her pod implies really that there is a culture going on, right? That there are shared behaviors, which by some definitions could be called distinctive culture. I teach culture, and when I do my introduction to culture courses, I try to help my students understand the difference between animals that have culture and animals that have kind of pre-programmed behavior. We call ants the social insects because a lot of what they do looks like what people would do in organized ways. But if you disrupt that behavior in any way, there's no adaptability among ants. Right. They're pre-programmed to act certain ways, and if they're not able to, then they perish. Versus, I actually use whales and whale vocalizations to show that whales are pre-programmed for culture. What goes into that space of culture in their lives is all learned. They learn it from their parents and from other whales. And so that might include language. Again, it might include, learning how to behave with other whales, learning how to behave with boats, that matter. So yeah, I find that they're a great way to help my students understand what culture is, right? That while we have the capacity for culture, we have to learn the things that fit into those places that we're ready to receive as our culture. I'm wondering if you could comment on that and whether you think that's true. Do cetaceans have culture?
Oh, most definitely. Cetaceans have culture. In particular, the orcas. Orcas have very, very strong family bonds. And they pass down information because they pass down those vocalization styles from adult to child. They learn those vocalizations. But there are other things too, like knowing where to find the salmon, where they go to get their fish, and the fact that they only eat a certain kind of fish, or they focus on that. And that what we call the residents, they're the fish eaters predominantly, and the transients, which are now called Biggs killer whales or Biggs orcas, they eat marine mammals. And they live in the same area. They look the same, mostly, to the common eye, they look the same. But they eat totally different things. So now that's resource sharing. They overlap physically, but they eat different things, so they can still coexist. And they also have interesting behaviors, like fads. Sometimes the orcas here will carry, for a year, they'll all be seen carrying kelp on one of their pectoral flippers.
And this is not an accident. They're like literally finding kelp and they're all carrying it in a certain place.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
Amazing.
Yeah. And then there's the mourning that we've seen happen. There's a mourning that we saw when this orca, and this was made news worldwide. Her calf died, and she carried it on her rostrum for a month, all around. Yeah, just wasn't ready to let it go.
Joe, I want to back up just a little bit. With our guests, we tend to want to know their stories. In other words, how did their passion for creation, for caring for whales in your case, how did that develop? What are some of the early roots of that?
As far as my connection to whales, that started when I was 3 years old, because Namu arrived on my 3rd birthday. Namu was the first orca to be held for a long time in captivity. Namu was captured up in Namu, Canada, and brought to Seattle, and was there for a year. My grandfather used to take me to see him all the time, and so I remember him well. And when my mom told me that he died, which was right before my 4th birthday, I just remember crying and crying because I was just devastated. He was my best friend. And so that connected me to whales to start with, but it was just, I didn't think that would be in my life. But to nature in general, I've just always cared about animals too. I used to love Dr. Dolittle and want to talk to animals. And that's probably why I call my new consulting company Cetacean Communication, because that's what I'm really interested in, is communication. And also some teachers. I remember watching Bless the Beasts and the Children in junior high. I can't remember whose class it was, but it was about the bison of North America, the buffalo. basically almost going extinct because of us, the Europeans coming in and just wiping them out. That really moved me. I mean, that was a really big impact on me. Yeah, and I've always felt this need for stewardship, I guess, and fixing things. I always loved Star Trek. I'm a big Trekkie, really big Trekkie. And when I was younger, I identified with Scotty, the engineer, and so I was always fixing things, and I'm good at fixing things. I'm good at building things. That's building hydrophones, right? And fixing hydrophones. And yeah, so I kind of want to fix the planet, fix what we've done.
Sure.
And that passion then, now that I have a child, is 19 years old, but that I have an obligation now. I feel a really strong obligation to fix things.
Interestingly enough, we share the NAMU connection in common. Probably what listeners don't know yet is that you and I went to middle school together and high school, et cetera. So I've known you for quite a while.
We were locker partners.
We were locker partners. I did not remember that.
Yeah.
But NAMU was an important, I guess, figure for me as well. And there was a movie made about NAMU, and there was a theme song that was written to that movie, which I can sing to you today. Maybe we'll sample it a bit here in the podcast. But the movie was essentially about, first of all, helping you to empathize and sympathize with this whale, and then to feel the pain of the bad endings, right? Of the how mistakes were made, and how, human lack of knowledge, lack of understanding, and bad motivations really led to the whale's demise. And I think for me, that just really kind of galvanized in me as a little kid even, the need to work for environmental justice, right? Work for justice for non-human creation.
What NAMU did, though, also was people were wanting to kill orcas back then. They thought they were a threat to the fishery. In Canada, they were about ready to set up a machine gun station at Seymour Narrows to machine gun down the orcas as they came by. So NAMU stopped all that, right? People started loving the whales, but then everybody wanted them. So when they started capturing them all, and they took half of the southern resident orcas, including Tokite.
For aquariums.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of stories that educate us and connect us, you've been involved in another story recently that's been in the news all around the world. Of course, it's the story of Tokite, an orca whale that has been at the center of a lot of conflict about how sea mammals are treated in captivity. Perhaps you could recount for us the story of Tokite, and then again, talk about how you became connected to it.
Yeah, okay. Well, I first really became aware of Tokite, who everybody was calling Lolita at the time, and that was her stage name. Probably back in the 1990s is when I really clued in. And there were efforts in the late 90s to try to bring her home from the Miami Seaquarium. And the owner was having none of it. And then it looked like there was no way that was ever going to happen. And I even, with my company, I boycotted selling any of my products to any aquariums that had orcas in captivity for entertainment purposes, which were all of them that had orcas. But then just recently, in the last year and a half, there was a new owner of the Miami Seaquarium, and he was willing to try to send her back home. So this organization was formed by some colleagues and friends of mine called the Friends of Tokite, Friends of Lolita at first, to try to work with them and bring in all the experts to make this happen. And they contacted me almost exactly a year ago to see if I could build some hydrophones for them, because they wanted to now start with the acoustics. They first wanted to record Tokite's sounds because they had not been recorded. So we wanted to know how she fits in with the southern residents, but then also record the sounds here and start playing them back for her so she could become acoustically acclimated to what would be her new home in a pen somewhere in the Salish Sea. Okay, so she would still be captive and still be under human care, but it would be in water that was the right temperature for her all the time, and in an area that was acoustically much nicer conditions for her than being in a concrete tank. But it took a while. There were still negotiations going on between the Friends of Tokite and the aquarium, and things kept getting delayed. And eventually it wasn't until the spring of this year that they started rolling forward to start getting the hydrophone stuff done. And in July, I went and I started making some preliminary recordings here and in the area where they were going to put the pen for her. And the pen, I think, was actually being built. And then I went down to help them set up the hydrophones and to start playing back some of the sounds on the day she died. My flight landed 1 hour after she died. So it was pretty traumatizing for me because it brought back the whole 3-year-old self with Namu.
Right. How did she die?
I haven't seen the necropsy results yet, but we know that her kidneys failed. They went really fast. Within 24 hours, she was being active. From one day she stopped eating or really cut down on her food. And by the next day she was dead. Yeah.
So the Lummi people, Lummi Native Americans tribe were very influential, of course, in making the case for her return.
Yes.
Because they, of course, live next to the area of the sea where she was originally taken from.
Yeah.
Talk to me more about that, how you think that had an impact. And I think maybe also lead into practice that you have of consulting with Native American groups.
Right. Well, yeah, the Lummi named her. They had a formal naming ceremony, and they named her Scully Choctanet, which is a name for the area where she was taken in Penn Cove. And it was actually a couple of friends who were part of the Friends of Tokite, I think 4 or 5 years ago, who connected me with the Lummi because they were doing another ceremony. They wanted to play some sounds underwater. And this was because of the Talakwa, the orca that I was talking about previously that was carrying her dead calf. They wanted to do a ceremony for her and for all the orcas. So I recorded some of their song and then converted it to whalese, basically. So I sped it up so it was more at the speed and the frequencies that the orcas are used to hearing for their own vocalizations. And so they played that underwater. It was around that time that I also became aware of their connection with trying to get Tokite home. They had their totem pole journey. So they took a totem pole all the way from Seattle to Miami as part of this, part of their efforts to educate people and to pray to bring Tokite home. And I think that their influence was probably the most important. I really do.
Let's now move on to the thing that takes most of your time, which is called World Pop. Tell us about that and about where you stand at the moment in terms of its genesis.
World Pop is a big event like Live Aid where many acts, many famous people will come together, as well as very well-known NGOs or environmentalists to have a concert. But instead of paying money, people will commit to doing things that they're not already doing. And I'm saying commit to doing 3 things you're not already doing for your local ecosystem. And the reason for local ecosystem is because that's what we care about. It's what we know. And it's really what matters for everybody at an individual level and a community level. So there'll be 20 minutes of music, and then somebody will come out and give a TED-like talk, on things that people can do while they're setting up for the next act, and then more music. And the reason for music is because music really, it connects people and it opens your heart. And I really think that it's a big thing that music does. And when your heart is open, then you're more able to connect. And so you're more able to connect to the message and to then be willing to take action and to have that integrate as part of your being.
Again, we come back to the idea that sound connects.
Yeah.
Well, Earthkeepers, the podcast has, as of today, listeners from 112 countries. Most of them are probably listening to the conversation here, wondering, what are the implications for me in terms of how to live in better relationship to creation? What might you say to folks that in terms of what they might take from this episode and apply in their own lives?
Seek out organizations that have information that can help you to help them, to help the planet, really to help your local area. Because part of World Pop will be live streaming worldwide, and I want to have NGOs on the ground everywhere so that no matter where you are, you can connect with somebody locally then to find out what you can do in your local area.
So I'm trying to form a thought that is coming together even as we speak, and that is, again, something that people might take away from our conversation, and that is, how do we find the stories that we connect to? And I would say even, how do we tell the stories that help others to connect to creation in ways that help them to care?
Yeah.
And I think in some ways that gives opportunity for artists and musicians and poets and photographers. We just actually spoke to someone from Jordan, and he talked about how his photography, he saw it mostly as a tool to help people understand what they couldn't see, understand what they couldn't really connect to without some help. So I think that there's really a role for people to become storytellers, as it were. Mm-hmm. I think your role is also that of a storyteller, right? You're telling us a story. You tell a lot of stories wherever you go, but your Hydrophones make some of the stories possible, right? It helps us to understand those points of connection that otherwise we would just have no idea are there. Well, you have for a lot of years been a champion of whales and dolphins, and I'm just wondering, what is it that keeps you going? Like, where do you find your hope?
I guess the thing that really keeps me going is kind of both a carrot and a stick in a way, right? So the idea of species going extinct constantly makes me very lonely. I feel incredibly sad when I think of all the things that we do to maximize everything just for humans at the detriment to all of nature. And to me, that's something that just needs to stop, and we need to fix. But then the carrot part is all the good. I see so many successes too. And we do make successes. There's always positive stories. There's always people out in the world who are doing wonderful things. And like so many of the people who were my customers throughout the last 3 decades, they're all out there, they're all heroes. And so I feel the need to make the world a better place for my child, his friends, his family, and all the generations to come. And that whole Native American saying of thinking 7 generations ahead, to me, I think it's crucial. I think we all need to think that way. And I think a lot of people in the world still do. But I know in this country in particular, it's not very common.
Yeah, I would go so far as to say that you could probably put yourself in that category of hero that you just described, in the sense that so much of the good work that's happened with listening to cetaceans was made possible by what you do. And I wonder if that's part of what sustaining our work is about, is taking time to look at our successes, to understand our influence, and maybe most importantly, just having the faith that doing the thing that we're made to do, that we're able to do, is enough.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's so many things that you can't do or aren't interested in doing, but if you tried, you probably wouldn't be that effective anyway, right? But you found this niche, this way of creating and inventing ways for us to hear better that made other heroes possible. Mm. What do you think?
Well, that sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've been talking with Joe Olson, designer of Hydrophones and a passionate advocate for cetaceans. To learn more about Joe's work and to find more in-depth information about the stories we referenced, simply go to this episode's show notes on our website at earthkeepers.online. I'm Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Avedon, and our producer is Dave Olfers. Colleen Megerly is our editor and researcher. Forrest Reed is the creator of our original music, and Jessalyn Gentry is our social media director. Thank you, friends, for listening, and please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.